Hi, my name is Sophie Lange, and I'm going to introduce to you the chapter Understanding and Controlling the Environment in Modern History from 1800 to 1900. In the 19th century, Europeans conceptualized and experienced the natural world in new ways. On the one hand, the natural environment became an important scientific object which triggered new political, economic, and technological developments and opportunities. With a better understanding of the natural world as a fragile ecosystem, there emerged a need to take responsibility for the well-being of all species and habitats. The idea to utilize nature in a more sustainable, improved, and economic way found its expression in the political need to regulate common resources like land, forests, and water more thoroughly. On the other hand, the developments and processes of industrialization and urbanization resulted in increased exploitation of resources and led to environmental pollution on an inconceivable scale. In the following few minutes, we will have a closer look upon the impact of science on nature, with an example given on forestry, and the effects of industrialization, as well as emerging organizations and movements. And I will conclude with an outlook on the debate about the Anthropocene. But first, we will start with two distinct views upon nature, which evolved since the 18th century. They can be described as imperial and Akkadian tradition. The Akkadian tradition assigned man a moral responsibility to take good care of God's creation. This strand of thought gained momentum in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and shaped the early conservation movement that emerged at the end of the 19th century. Then again, the imperial tradition gave mankind authority over all living creatures and scientific and technological means with which it could master, exploit, and control nature. Fundamental to the imperial view of nature was a conceptual division between the natural world and human society. Two preconditions have been necessary hereby to make nature serve the needs of society. First, scientists and researchers throughout Europe engaged in a massive effort to classify, catalog, and describe nature, to observe it, and to gather information. Secondly, once they decoded nature, they started using it. Thus, scientists directly focused on the exploitation of nature. Embracing the ethos of liberal capitalism, scientific understanding thus shifted towards seeing nature as a dynamic result of competition between various actors and elements, which needed to be dominated by humans and cultivated into a dependable economic resource. So this happened, for instance, with forests. Here we are going to this guy. Hans Karl Karlowitz has written a book called Silvicultura Economica in 1713. In a context of ever-growing demand for trees, forestry manuals like this provided royal employees with a technocratic and quantifiable framework. Thus, forestry services and science developed in the 19th century, in which forestry officers attempted to create homogeneous masses of trees. They did it in order to facilitate their commercial exploitation and increase fiscal revenues. There were, of course, ecological as well as socio-political consequences from that. On the one side, the impact of forestry and wildlands regulations changed. In most Catholic countries between the French Revolution and 1848, church lands were privatized. Or in Russia in 1861, the serfs were emancipated. These reforms very often went hand in hand with the enclosure of land and the privatization of the commons, a tendency that became widespread throughout Europe. Their success brought about the reduction of untilled surfaces. On the other side, The ploughing of land, the destruction of spontaneous pastures, and production of monocultural landscapes in the forests also had environmental consequences, like the simplification of species, a reduction of biodiversity, a transformation of landscapes, and in the Mediterranean countries, a shorter supply of organic fertilizers, which had a significant impact upon agriculture. But land and forests were not the only resources that were regulated by national and imperial states. Water streams and springs increasingly became public resources, or at least subject to public regulation, like the building of canals and supply systems for urban centers and factories. As you can see here, for example, the Canal de Isabel II in Madrid, or the Ludwig-Donau-Main-Canal, or the Canal de Lourdes in Paris. At the same time, views on natural catastrophes and their political prevention changed and new protective measures were carried out. Floods were tempered by straightening rivers like the Rhine. Canalizations were carried out in major cities like Hamburg, Vienna, and London. And there were efforts to reforest mountains to prevent avalanches in Switzerland. Now we will have a short look upon the industrialization and the environment. The industrialization process in the long 19th century also had far-reaching impacts on the natural environment. The economic, technological, and societal change from an agrarian to an industrial society marked the transition from handmade to machine-made production. It led to growing populations, improved living standards, and an accelerated national productivity, which you can see here in the picture. Boosted by the invention of steam and combustion engines in the 18th century, as well as the commercial use of electricity at the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution marked a fundamental turning point in the history of the relationship between humans and nature. The key element enabling this revolution was energy. Coal replaced water and wood as the primary energy resource. The exploitation of coal, the need of faster transportation systems for goods, and rapid urbanization caused by the influx of rural populations into cities profoundly transformed the natural environment. You will find more detailed information on the industrial process if you read this chapter. Just let me add this. The air and water pollution by the emerging iron, steel, and coke industry caused health problems among people and animals living in close proximity to industrial areas. Environmental problems like the so-called smoke pest or smoke plague, sulfurous air, and toxic water became vital issues in cities. Thus, in response to all the challenges that came with urban life, organizations and movements were founded which strived for the improvement of social and sanitary conditions in cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Middle-class social reformers demanded that their municipal authorities provide better protection from air and water pollution. For example, Rudolf Virchow, an early social hygiene reformer in Prussia. He was a medical practitioner who fought for the establishment of hospitals and children's playgrounds in poor districts, as well as for medical education for nurses. But as it has actually been in the European colonies overseas before the environmental consequences of the Industrial Revolution became the more and more visible at home. Scientists from Britain, France, and Germany, like the brothers von Humboldt, experienced for the first time how human expansion and activities degraded a natural beauty that they equated with biblical Eden. It was in the colonies too, with the economic interests of the metropole and local hunting interests in mind, that enlightened administrators to apply forest and soil conservation measures for the first time. As part of an imperial policy protecting timber, for example, the British colonial regime in India established forest reserves already in the 1850s. So, to come to an end here, I want to finish this lecture with an outlook to the academic debate on the Anthropocene. All these rapid developments from the 19th century onwards in industrialization, urbanization, population growth, and the exploitation of resources, especially the massive use of coal, launched the beginning of a new geological era called the Anthropocene. Already in 1873, geologist Antonio Stoppani introduced the idea of an Anthropozoic era where humankind started influencing the biosphere's biological, geological, and atmospheric processes. In 2000, following Stoppani's idea, the chemists Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer started an international discussion about the notion that humankind effectively is a geological factor which now alters the relatively stable environmental conditions of the Holocene. This debate still goes on. The question here is, among others, whether the Anthropocene might have started in the time of the Industrial Revolution or not. So, these are the sources of all the images used in this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy reading the chapter with a lot more information on the environment, in the 19th century. So, goodbye.